Now that you've got some practice with just simplifying numbers under a radical, we're going to start talking about, well, what do you do if they put a variable under the radical? Okay, there's actually two ways to think about it. Okay, number one, you can think of when you have a variable under the radical, you can think power over root, and I'll talk about that in a second, or the other way that you could do these problems if there's a variable and you have to take the square root of it is you could write it out. So this kind of has some steps to it. You could write it out, and then you're going to find groups, okay, or circle groups, I guess. Okay, so I'm going to explain both ways, and then you can choose whichever way works for you, okay? And so just kind of thinking about it, just like with numbers, you're still looking for what, in this case, variable times itself gives you this under the radical. So sometimes you could figure it out that way, but if it's not working for you, you have two other ways to do it, okay? And so like if you think back to when we did the numbers, like if we were doing this one, you're asking what number times itself gives you the number under the radical. Well, for these, you're asking what variable times itself gives you this under the radical, okay? And so one thing that you will have to remember is, because you're multiplying, one thing that we've talked about is if you take a variable times the same variable, remember a rule that we talked about is you have to multiply them, remember you have to add their exponents. So like this would be x to the first, that would be x to the first. So if you're multiplying them, remember you add their exponents. So like x to the first times x to the first, it'd be x to the, and then you add them. So 1 plus 1 is 2. Okay, so that's something that you have to remember here. And so if you were trying to just reason through it, for this one, if we're taking the square root of x to the fourth, you're asking what variable times itself, it has to be the same thing, would end up giving you x to the fourth. And you might realize that if I take x squared times itself, I will end up, because you have to add these, you'll end up getting the x to the fourth. And so the answer here would actually be x squared, okay? And so if you can kind of think through it like that, there's nothing wrong with that. But if that's not working for you, there are two other ways to do it, okay? And so, well, what if it didn't work? Like maybe you couldn't figure out, okay, what variable times itself gives you that. Well, the first way that you can kind of figure it out is you're going to take whatever the power is, which is the exponent, that's with the variable, and you are going to divide that by whatever numbers associated with the root or the radical, okay? And so if it's a square root, then it's technically a 2 right here. We just don't put it. And so you're going to take whatever the exponent is and put it over the root, and that would actually be the exponent of what you get for your answer. So notice if I take the exponent here, which is 4, and it's still going to be an exponent, so it's still going to have that x as the base. Okay, so it would be 4 over power over, and then the root, it's a square root, so it'd be over a 2. And notice when you simplify that, 4 over 2 ends up being 2. And so notice you get the same answer. So you can think of it as you take the power or the exponent that's with that variable, and then you put it over the root, okay? The other way that you could have done this one, so instead of doing power over root, is you could have actually wrote out what this actually means. So like if you have x to the fourth, what that technically means is, remember, an exponent tells you how many times you multiply that times itself. So this would be the same thing as saying we're taking x times itself 4 times, okay? And so you could write it out, however many x's you're supposed to have, and then the group part that I'm talking about here, it depends on your radical. So if it's a square root, that means you're going to be circling groups of 2. And however many groups you have or you can make would be the exponent of what you come out, or what comes out of it. So notice the radical is a 2, so you're going to write it out. and then you circle groups of 2. So there's a group of 2, there's a group of 2, and however many groups you have is actually going to be the exponent of your answer. So you can take it from underneath the radical, and then we made 2 groups, so it'd be x to the 2nd power as your answer. And so notice, no matter which way we did it, you end up with the same answer, okay? And then you could check it. You could take that times itself, and you should end up with x to the 4th, okay? So you can choose whichever way you want, all right? So, well, what if we were doing this one? You can think through it. What variable times itself would give you m to the 6th? If that wasn't working, you could take, okay, power over root. So to get my answer, I would have to take, and it's still going to be m to that power, you're going to take the exponent, so the exponent is 6, over whatever the root is. So if it's a square root, that means the root is going to have a 2 with it, so power over root. And then when you simplify that, whatever you get there would be your exponent. So 6 over 2 ends up being 3. So your answer would be m to the 3rd. If you didn't like that way, you could write it out. So if we wrote it out, I would have m to the 6th, so that would be m times itself 6 times. So you'd write out 6 m's. So m, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which notice this way could get a little tiring after a while. And then you circle groups depending on what your radical is. So it's a square root, so that means I'm circling groups of 2. If it was a cube root, I'd be circling groups of 3. A 4th root, I'd be circling groups of 4. Okay, but it's a square root. So I'm going to see how many groups of 2 I can make. And so there were 3. So you write down that letter as your base. And then however many groups you could make is your exponent. So the square root of m to the 6th would be m to the 3rd. And so notice, no matter which way we do it, we get the same answer. Okay, so that's how you simplify radicals under a root. Okay, so now we're going to do some problems where they can start adding stuff with it. Okay, so notice for the 3rd example here, we've got 2 things underneath the radical. You've got to take the square root of 16, and then you also have to do the b to the 4th. So when they have more than one thing underneath the radical, what you're actually going to do is you're going to split it up. So we're going to start by figuring out what the square root of 16 is, and then you're going to figure out what the square root of b to the 4th is, okay? Do them separately, and then in the end, you can just put them back together, okay? So when we put our answer together, we'll put it up here, all right? So the square root of 16, what number times itself gives you 16? And that would be 4, so that's part of your answer. And then the square root of b to the 4th. So you can do it with the power over root, or you could write it out in circle groups. And so if I did it power over root, it would be b to the exponent is 4, and then over, well, the root is a square root, so it'd be over 2. And then I just simplify, so 4 over 2 ends up being 2. So that's the other part of my answer. Once you get these 2, notice they're being multiplied. So this is what you got for the square after you took the square roots, so you don't have the square roots anymore. And all you do is you take 1 times the other. And we don't typically put a multiplication between them, and so you can just write it like that. So your answer would be 4b to the 2nd. So there we go. Okay, so if there's more than one thing under the radical, you just do each one separately, and then you put them together at the end. Okay, so we're going to practice that a little bit. So notice here you have an x to the 8th, and then you have a y to the 10th. It's more than one thing under the radical, so you're going to split it up. So we're going to take the square root of x to the 8th, and then we're going to figure out what the square root of y to the 10th is, and then we'll put them together for our answer. So again, you can do power over the root, or you could write it out and circle your groups, either way. Okay, so if I did power over root here, it'd be x to the power is 8, over the root is a square root, so it'd be the over 2. And then I'd figure that out. 8 over 2 ends up being 4. So that's part of my answer. This one, I'll show you the write it out method. So if I wrote it out, I'd have 10 y's, okay, which again, that could get kind of a little bit tiring after a while. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then you're circling groups of, well, it's a square root, so we're circling groups of 2. So that'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 groups. So however many groups you circled is the exponent of what you take out. Okay, so that's the write it out method. Or if you did power over root, it'd be 10 over 2, which is a little easier, and 10 over 2 is 5. So either way, you get the same answer. So that's the answer for the x part. This is the answer for the y part, and then you just put them together. So they're being multiplied, so it'd be x to the 4th times y to the 5th. And that would be the square root of x to the 8th, y to the 10th. Okay, so this next one, look at how many things are under the radical. That's how many things, or how many different radicals you're going to split it up into. So like for this one, we have the 49, the a to the 2nd, and then the b to the 24th. So that means you have 3 different radicals that you will have to split it up into. So you got that part. You've got the square root of a to the 2nd, and then you have the square root of b to the 24th. Okay, so do each one separately, and then you just write it together at the end. So square root of 49, what number times itself gives you 49? That would be 7. This one, you could do power over root, so the power is 2 over the root is 2. So that just ends up being 1. So your answer would be a to the 1st, which we could just write as a. And then this one, it'd be b to the, well, the power, or the exponent is 24 over the root is a 2. So 24 over 2, it'd be b to the 12th. Okay, so these are all of your little answers, and you put them together. So it'd be 7 times a, and then times b to the 12th. And so there is your answer. Okay, so find them separately, and then you just kind of put them being multiplied at the end. All right, so this next one, how many things, how many radicals are we going to have to separate it into? That's the first question you should be asking yourself. And so notice you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 things. So separate them into the 4 different parts. Okay, so we got the square root of 625, the square root of r to the 10th, the square root of s to the 20th, and then the square root of t to the 30th. Okay, so square root of 625, that one's a little harder, so you're going to have to kind of think through it. What number times itself gives you 625? And if you sit there and kind of think through it and reason through it, you'll figure out that ends up being 25, because if I take 25 times itself, I get 625. This one, r to the 10th, power over root, so it'd be the exponent, or the power is 10 over the root is a square root, so it'd be over 2. So 10 over 2, you'd have r to the 5th after that. And so notice the write it out method gets a little long after a while, because writing out 20 s's would not be very fun. Okay, so using the power over root will be helpful. So this one, the power is 20 over the root is 2. So that would be s to the 10th. This one, it'd be t, well, the power is 30 over, the root is a square root still, so it'd be over 2. So it'd be t to the 15th. Okay, so these are our 4 different answers. Then we just put them together, kind of like they were here, where we multiply them all together. So it'd be 25, r to the 5th, s to the 10th, and then t to the 15th. Okay, so just don't forget to put them together at the end. All right, so now going back to, well, what if you have a fraction? Well, remember I talked about with a fraction, you can split it up into, okay, put the radical over the top part, and then you put the radical over the bottom part. And then now you have another element to it. Now you have 2 things on the top and then 2 things on the bottom. So you'll go to the side, and we'll do the top part first. So you'd have to do the square root of 4, and then the square root of x to the 12th. So the square root of 4 is 2, so I'm going to go ahead and write it down here. The square root of x to the 12th, well, that would be x to the 12 over 2, power over root. So that'd be x to the 6th. And then on the bottom, you split it up here. So it'd be the square root of 25, and then the square root of y to the 14th. So the square root of 25 is 5. So I'm going to write it there. And then this would be y to the 14 over 2 power over root. So that'd be y to the 7th. Okay, and then now if these two numbers would reduce, like if there's a number that goes into both of those, you have to reduce them. But notice these don't have a common factor. So there we go. That would be my answer. Okay, so that one had a little bit extra to it. All right, so let's do one more. And then hopefully you guys will feel good about doing the work. All right, so this one, notice you've got a number up front, just like what we talked about on the other side of these notes. When you have a number up front, this is technically being multiplied times it because there's nothing between them. So that number is going to come down and you're going to multiply it times whatever you get for your answer. And so now we have to go to the side just like we did before, and we got to split this up. So we got the square root of 49, and then we've got the square root of x to the 16th. Okay, so the square root of 49 is 7, and then the square root of x to the 16th, well, power over root, so it'd be 16 over the root is 2, so that ends up being x to the 8th. Okay, so now that we did that, we have to put it over here, and don't forget you have to multiply times that number up front, so don't forget about that number up front. So it'd be times 7 x to the 8th. Okay, so now you just take the numbers and multiply them. So negative 3 times 7 ends up being negative 21, and then that x to the 8th doesn't have anything to multiply with, so it just comes down. So there is your answer.